My name is Mike Boylan, and I'm a senior consulting engineer in Apple's worldwide field engineering organization focused on macOS deployment and management. I'm really excited to be here for virtual JNUC 2021 to take you through deploying macOS Monterey. macOS Monterey brings powerful features designed to allow you to connect, share, and create like never before, get things done faster, and work seamlessly across Apple devices. And there are a number of platform changes, new management features, and lots of deployment workflow improvements for IT as well. The agenda for today's session is a detailed overview of those platform changes, information specific to deploying Mac computers with Apple Silicon, deployment workflow guidance, including best practices for one-to-one and shared deployments, and then we'll wrap up by covering some programs and resources to help you be successful in your deployments of macOS. For those of you that have attended presentations like this one in the past, including at JNUC last year, note that while the structure of this content may seem familiar, it's been updated all throughout for macOS Monterey, including changes since the initial beta was released this summer. We hope you'll stay tuned for the entire presentation, so let's get started with platform changes. Erase all content and settings quickly resets a Mac to its current OS version, cryptographically removing all user data in the process. Erase all content and settings is supported on Mac computers with the Apple T2 security chip and Apple Silicon. Sending the erase device command from MDM to supported Mac models in macOS Monterey will initiate erase all content and settings by default. The previous erase device behavior, called obliteration, is only used as a fallback behavior, and we'll discuss that more shortly. On Mac computers with Apple Silicon, any startup security settings that have been modified in Recovery OS are also reset. We know that you might not want a user to be able to easily erase their Mac themselves, so there is a restriction available from MDM to prevent a user from running the Erase Assistant in macOS, even as an administrator. A few more things to know about erase all content and settings when initiating it from MDM. The Mac must be booted from an internal, sealed system volume, and it must be booted from the first partition on the disk if there are multiple. If the Mac does have multiple volumes or partitions, they will be removed during the process. External volumes are not erased. Mac computers with Apple Silicon must have a bootstrap token available from MDM to authorize the erase. Intel-based Mac computers with the Apple T2 security chip must be in full security mode, and if an EFI firmware password is set, it needs to be cleared before initiating erase all content and settings. In macOS 12.01 and later, MDM can send the set firmware password command to clear the firmware password, followed by an erase device command to initiate erase all content and settings without requiring an intermediary reboot between the commands. When one or more of the requirements for erase all content and settings initiated with MDM are not met, by default, a Mac will fall back to the macOS 11 behavior called obliteration. Obliteration requires full reinstallation of macOS before the Mac can be used. You can optionally control this fallback behavior by specifying the new obliteration behavior key in the erase device command from MDM. You can specify whether the Mac should or should not fall back to obliteration, and each option controls the response code sent back to MDM. This option is useful to ensure you don't accidentally end up needing to fully reinstall macOS when you only intended to erase all content and settings instead. Triggering erase all content and settings from MDM requires a Mac computer to reactivate in Recovery OS. However, we're super excited to announce that in macOS 12.01 and later, on Mac computers with the Apple T2 security chip, erase all content and settings initiated from MDM can be used in combination with Auto Advance that we introduced last year in macOS Big Sur. If connected to Ethernet, the Mac can complete the entire cycle of erasing the device, reactivating in Recovery OS, and rebooting back into macOS to automatically enroll in MDM. These two technologies combined together result in an incredibly fast return to service and reprovisioning strategy for remote Mac computers. In macOS Big Sur, we enabled managed apps on macOS, including support for managed app configuration and feedback, and the ability to remove an app with an MDM command or when a device unenrolls from MDM. New in macOS Monterey, if you use user enrollment for BYOD environments, managed app data is separated on a different volume, and managed apps that use CloudKit now use the managed Apple ID associated with the MDM profile. When the app is removed, the data container is erased. Managed Apple IDs also now support iCloud Drive for user enrollments. The organizational iCloud Drive appears as an additional location in Finder. Watch the Discover Account-Driven User Enrollment session from WWDC 2021 for more details. Since macOS 10.15 Catalina, scripting language runtimes such as Python, Ruby, and Perl have been included in macOS for compatibility with legacy software only. Future versions of macOS won't include scripting language runtimes by default and might require you to install additional packages. If software you use depends on scripting languages, it's recommended that vendors bundle the runtimes within their apps instead. In macOS Monterey, the previously bundled system PHP has been removed. Python 2 was officially sunset as of January 2020 by the Python Software Foundation and isn't recommended to be used. In macOS Monterey, a graphical dialog will appear when an app tries to use the built-in system Python 2.7. It's important to note that the dialog displays the calling app information. So if an MDM agent runs a script that you wrote that's calling the system Python, the dialog may display the name of the agent app, even though they may not actually be using Python in their app at all. For that reason, it's recommended to check your scripts for usage of the system Python and update them as necessary. Future versions of macOS won't include Python 2.7. It's recommended that you install and manage your own runtimes, including Python 3. You can also call the system Python 3 if needed, but that requires the Xcode command line tools to be installed. We continue to add additional user privacy protections to macOS. In macOS Monterey, apps or services that require the installation or configuration of pluggable authentication modules, or PAM modules, now require user authorization. Authorization can also be granted using a privacy preferences policy control profile from MDM that grants full disk access or access to system administrator files. Many MDMs already grant their agent tools access to these categories, so it's possible your existing workflows won't need to change at all to accommodate this new protection. In macOS Monterey, using the socket filter FW command line tool or MDM to manage the system firewall are mutually exclusive. If any options for the firewall are configured using MDM, the command line tool will not allow modifying any settings, even by an administrator. We've enhanced the MDM manageability of the system firewall in macOS Monterey by enabling the configuration of the logging options, including setting logging to be on and to what level. Currently configured logging options are also now provided to MDM in the security info query to help with compliance reporting. Note that when managing the system firewall using MDM, the options for allowing signed downloaded or system apps for incoming connections are always enabled. These map back to the command line options for allow download signed enabled and allow signed enabled set to on. We've talked about system extensions for a number of years now, and we hope that developers you work with have already made the transition away from kernel extensions. When deploying and managing system extensions to avoid unnecessary approval prompts to users, best practice is to deploy the configuration payloads to approve the extensions before apps attempt to load them. But we know that's not always possible. So in macOS 11.3 and later, installing a system extension payload changes the state of the extension. For example, if a system extension is already pending user approval, installing the payload will activate the extension. Conversely, removing the payload will deactivate the system extension and mark it for removal on the next reboot of the Mac. But to make it even easier to remove a system extension in macOS Monterey, there's a new configuration option in the system extension payload called Removable System Extensions. An app in this list can deactivate its own system extensions, for example, when an app is uninstalled. With this key set, there's no admin password required to remove the system extension, allowing for a fully automated removal. Many system extensions require more than just a system extension payload to fully configure them. For example, a system extension that's built with the network extension framework may need to set up a content filter, which you can enable and approve using a content filter payload. Some extensions may also require privacy preferences policy control payloads, and you may wish to manage notifications for critical apps that use system extensions. Check with your system extension vendors on configurations needed to fully enable and configure the solutions, as well as to inquire about their compatibility with any other system extensions you plan to run at the same time. This is especially important if you plan to use products from multiple vendors together. The built-in Kerberos extension offers a way to provide directory connectivity to an on-premise Active Directory environment without actually needing to bind a Mac computer itself to the directory. In one-to-one deployments, we recommend using the Kerberos extension or solutions like it along with local accounts instead of traditional directory binding and mobile accounts whenever possible. We built the Kerberos extension into the operating systems in macOS Catalina and iOS and iPadOS 13, and it is the replacement for Enterprise Connect on macOS. Enterprise Connect is officially sunset as of macOS Monterey, and running Enterprise Connect on macOS Monterey is not supported. The Kerberos extension has some new optional settings in macOS Monterey. You can now specify a preferred Kerberos distribution center, or KDC, for your Mac computers to use, and you can limit access to the Kerberos credential to only apps that match bundle IDs in a configured access control list that are explicitly installed as managed. Additionally, you can allow the standard system Kerberos utilities, including Ticket Viewer and Klist, to access and use the credential too. We've also improved the reliability for checking for required password changes. For more details on the Kerberos extension, please check out the Leverage Enterprise Identity and Authentication session from WWDC 2020. There are a number of changes to TLS certificate trust on macOS Monterey. Underscores and DNS names are now allowed. Multiple extensions with the same extend ID are rejected. Key usage is more strictly enforced. And pathlin constraints on enterprise root CAs are enforced. For SMIME, certificates with RSA keys less than 2048 bits are no longer trusted. In macOS Monterey, Mac computers with Apple Silicon now support the 802.11k, v, and R Wi-Fi standards for optimized roaming on enterprise networks. The IPv6 only preferred option is also now supported in DHCP v4 on all Mac computers that support macOS Monterey, which allows IPv6 capable devices to forego the assignment of an IPv4 address. There's also a restriction available for preventing the use of iCloud Private Relay, a new iCloud Plus feature that helps protect users' privacy when they browse the web in Safari. You can block iCloud Private Relay on a specific network using DNS, but this restriction prevents it from being enabled on the Mac in the first place. If you use Proxy Auto-Configuration or pack files to configure your Mac computers to use a proxy, there are important changes in macOS Monterey to be aware of. Using HTTP URLs for pack files is deprecated. Web Proxy Auto-Discovery or WPAD via DNS is not affected by this change. For any other configurations of pack files though, including WPAD via DHCP option 252, macOS Monterey may attempt to access the pack file over HTTPS first before eventually falling back to the HTTP URL. Consult with your networking teams about these changes, as only secure URL schemes should be used for pack files going forward. In macOS Monterey, you can now share, play, or present content from another Apple device to a Mac. This is super helpful to allow for easier sharing of schoolwork, giving demos of applications, or to simply more easily mirror or extend your display, just to list a few possibilities. Mac also now works as an Airplay speaker and can even function as a secondary speaker to create multi-room audio. The Airplay receiver feature is on by default and defaults to only accepting devices with the same Apple ID, although this automatic discovery is disabled for managed Apple IDs. The Airplay receiver can be turned off or security settings changed in the sharing pane and system preferences. Note that the same network option still prompts for permission via notification in Notification Center and requests the user enter a device-specific PIN code. Even when not connected to Wi-Fi, the Everyone option supports peer-to-peer discovery and connectivity between the sender and receiving Mac. When initiating an Airplay connection from a device for the first time, the Airplay code screen is shown with the PIN code, and once connected, the Airplay session appears in full screen on the Mac. macOS Monterey brings shortcuts to the Mac. Shortcuts are the future of Mac automation, and macOS Monterey begins a multi-year transition away from Automator. We still care deeply about Automator and everyone who relies on it, so in order to make the transition as smooth as possible, we've built a migration tool that can convert most Automator workflows into shortcuts, including with full support for AppleScript and shell scripting. For more details on this transition, watch the Meet Shortcuts for macOS session from WWDC 2021. That wraps up platform changes. Now let's discuss the transition to Apple Silicon. Mac began the transition to its own custom silicon last year with M1. This gives the Mac new and exciting performance as well as powerful new technologies. This change allows for a common architecture across all Apple products, making it easier for developers to write and optimize their apps for the entire Apple ecosystem. We will continue to support Intel-based Mac computers for years to come. Let's review some considerations for deploying and managing Mac computers with Apple Silicon. Mac computers with Apple Silicon have a feature called Mac Sharing Mode that replaces Target Disk Mode. Mac Sharing Mode provides access to the macOS volume in its entirety and not just access to a particular user's home folder. The host Mac with Apple Silicon shows up on the target Mac you're connecting it to in Finder, just like a mounted network share. All you need to do is connect as guest. The target Mac can be an Intel-based Mac. Mac Sharing Mode uses SMB for connectivity over a Thunderbolt or USB cable, and because it's file-based, block copying data over this interface using tools like ASR or Apple Software Restore are not supported. Once a Mac has been set up with a user account, if File Vault or Activation Lock is enabled, using Mac Sharing Mode requires authentication. Mac computers with Apple Silicon have a recovery environment called Recovery OS. Instead of using Command-R like on an Intel-based Mac, you access it by holding down the power button at startup and waiting for the prompt that says Loading Startup Options. In macOS Monterey, the recovery environment that loads is the one in the same APFS volume group as your current startup volume. From Recovery OS, you can reinstall macOS or perform other troubleshooting actions. Intel-based Mac computers offer Internet recovery as a secondary recovery environment in case it's needed, but Mac computers with Apple Silicon include a second, separate system recovery environment locally on device. If needed, you can access it by double pressing and holding the power button. Note, however, that startup security settings cannot be changed from the system recovery environment. On Mac computers with Apple Silicon, macOS has a new unified login experience and allows for new features even when File Vault is on. A great new feature for organizations is that the username and password view is now supported. It also has built-in support for authentication with CCID and PIV-compatible smart cards, and includes voiceover support for greater accessibility. macOS Monterey also supports unlocking and booting the Mac directly with the File Vault Personal Recovery Key, or PRK, allowing for much faster access to an encrypted Mac to troubleshoot or assist users. On this Apple Silicon MacBook Pro, the unified login experience is shown. Notice the username and password field even though File Vault is on. To boot the Mac using the PRK, you can simply press Option-Shift-Return and enter the PRK in the recovery key field. Simply press Return or click the forward arrow when finished to boot the Mac. We recommend organizations use PRKs instead of institutional recovery keys going forward, and we'll discuss that more in the deployment workflow section of the presentation. On unmanaged Mac computers with Apple Silicon, loading kernel extensions requires manually lowering the security settings of the Mac in Recovery OS, and installing software updates always requires authentication by a user. For organizations, the ability to perform these tasks is automatically enabled for devices enrolled into MDM with automated device enrollment and leverages the Bootstrap token. For devices that are supervised using device enrollment, reduced security can be manually enabled in Recovery OS to allow MDM to manage kernel extensions if needed. As of macOS 11.2, even for device enrollments, downgrading the security in Recovery OS is not necessary for MDM to manage and install software updates to a newer version still being signed by Apple. Mac computers with Apple Silicon introduced the concept of ownership. Ownership can loosely be defined as the user who has first claimed a Mac for configuring it for their use and is not tied to true legal ownership or chain of custody. Ownership defines who is authorized to make changes to the startup security policy for a specific install of macOS. The security policy defines the restrictions around which versions of macOS can boot on Mac computers with Apple Silicon, as well as how and if third-party kernel extensions can be loaded or managed. Ownership is backed by cryptography protected in the secure enclave and should really be more of an implementation detail versus a primary consideration for deployment. In most cases, previous considerations for ensuring the granting of secure token in organizational environments will ensure ownership is granted to the right users too, as the first user to be granted the first secure token on the system becomes the first volume owner. On Mac computers with Apple Silicon, you'll be prompted for owner credentials before making any changes to startup security policies in Recovery OS and when installing software updates or running the macOS installer. But remember, managed devices can also leverage the Bootstrap token from MDM if MDM is installing an update. It's possible to be an owner and not be an administrator, but certain tasks requiring ownership will check for both. For example, modifying startup security settings requires being both an administrator and an owner, whereas a software update can be installed by a standard user who is an owner. User ownership status is visible using the disutil apfs list users / command. The GUIDs listed of type local Open Directory user map back to generated UID attributes of user records in Open Directory. A big consideration with the move to a new processing architecture is application compatibility. Using Universal 2 application binaries, developers can easily create a single app that runs natively on both Mac computers with Apple Silicon and Intel-based Mac computers. Developers can easily convert their existing apps to run on Apple Silicon, and for the first time, developers can make their iOS and iPadOS apps available on Mac without any modifications. And macOS 11.3 and later, MDM can install iOS and iPadOS apps on Mac computers with Apple Silicon. And with the translation technology of Rosetta 2, users can run most existing Mac apps that have not been updated, including those with plugins. In macOS Monterey, Rosetta is not removed during OS updates if it's already been installed. As Rosetta cannot translate kernel extensions must be recompiled to run on Apple Silicon if they're needed, but hopefully the vendors you work with have already moved to system extensions. And the hypervisor framework allows for virtualization to be possible as well. And finally, Apple Configurator 2 for Mac is a great tool for IT in working with Mac computers with Apple Silicon. It can update Recovery OS and the firmware of the Mac to the latest version using the Revive option. And it can optionally install a fresh copy of the latest version of macOS or from a previously saved IPSW file if you choose the Restore option. With the Restore option, any previous data on any internal volumes is unrecoverable. The Restore option makes Apple Configurator 2 a great option for rapid return to service on Mac computers with Apple Silicon. Note that upgrading macOS in place is not supported using Apple Configurator 2. So that's a summary of important considerations for deployment for Mac computers with Apple Silicon. Now let's discuss deployment workflows, including best practices for both one-to-one and shared deployments. We'll start with an incredibly important topic for organizations, managing software updates. At WWDC 2021, my colleague Lucy from the Apple Software Update team gave a great session detailing improvements to managing software updates across Apple platforms. That session contained a wealth of information for MDM developers and admins alike, and we'd encourage you to watch it. Here, we'll provide some additional guidance specifically for you as an admin. First, let's start with the Software Update command line tool, as we recognize that a lot of organizations currently wrap tooling around it to manage software updates on macOS. The Software Update command line tool is still supported and is not deprecated. It requires elevated privileges to run on both Intel and Apple Silicon, but on Apple Silicon, it asks for user credentials for a volume owner to install a software update. By default, the tool will prompt for these credentials interactively, but macOS Monterey also includes options for passing the user credentials directly into the command. And in macOS Monterey, you can use the Software Update CLI tool at the login window to install software updates too. While the Software Update command line tool is still supported, and you may be able to modify existing tooling or workflows to accommodate the authentication requirement on Apple Silicon, you should use MDM and the Schedule OS Update command to deploy software updates to manage Mac computers going forward in an organization. Using MDM will help you unify update deployment workflows across both Intel-based Mac computers and Mac computers with Apple Silicon. There are 3 stages of managing software updates: testing, deploying, and enforcing. Let's start with testing and the ability to defer software updates. When we release a beta version of an OS, you have time and tools to test the OS in your environment before it's released, including with test plans and focused release notes in AppleSeed for IT. Once an update is publicly released, software update deferral restrictions that you can apply from MDM prevent software updates from being offered to users until a specified period of time has expired. This period of time is configurable from 1 to 90 days, and update visibility on a Mac relative to the deferral period is based on the publication date of an update and not when a client Mac computer first discovers the update. In macOS 11.3 or later, you can set separate independent deferral windows for major, minor, and non-OS updates such as Safari. And while the maximum deferral window for all update types is 90 days, note that installing a major macOS upgrade as a user requires administrator credentials and running an Install Assistant application. Also, it's really important to note that while deferred updates aren't visible in the Software Update Preference pane or in the output of the Software Update command line tool, MDM still has the ability to install specific updates on devices. In other words, an update does not need to be visible to a user in order for MDM to be able to install it. This gives you the flexibility to, for example, completely skip a particular update in your environment and simply instruct your Mac computers to jump ahead to a newer OS update if you prefer it. Once you've tested, next you're ready to deploy software updates. When using MDM to update a device, MDM sends a schedule OS update command. The command on macOS has several different modes of operation known as install actions. The available install actions are download only, notify only, install ASAP, which is the default, install force restart, and install later. Let's go through them now. Download only is useful for both attended and unattended devices to download an update in the background before installation time. Notify only can be used to alert users that there's an action for installation. Neither of these options actually start an install. Install ASAP or default is the primary update mechanism on macOS. It's ideal for unattended or remote macOS devices, or for situations where you may want to enforce an update as quickly as possible, but still respect applications that may currently need to block a restart for updating, such as if a critical task needs to finish running. Unless an application blocks restart, this action performs the update as soon as possible once the download finishes, with an option displayed in a notification for a user to cancel the restart within 60 seconds. In macOS Monterey, the 60-second countdown timer is displayed for both major and minor updates. Install ASAP is also the install action that should and can be used for major macOS upgrades using MDM. For example, you can upgrade a Mac from macOS Big Sur 11.5 and later to macOS Monterey using only MDM without needing to separately download the full macOS installer first and without the use of any scripting tools like startosinstall. Install force restart is the ultimate enforcement action for installing an update, as it ignores any blocking applications and installs the update as quickly as possible. This is ideal for ensuring compliance by an absolute date as long as the device is online, or for unattended or remote systems where it doesn't matter what's happening on the device in the current moment. Note that this action can cause data loss, as again, it does not stop for blocking applications, so it should be used with extreme caution. Last but not least is install later. Install later allows you to schedule an update for installing that night if possible, and is analogous to the install tonight option that the standard software update system offers to a user. The device will choose a window of time based on machine learning, using conditions such as when the device is least used for the install to occur, which usually happens between 2 and 4 a.m. A number of changes to make these install actions even more useful to organizations were made in macOS Monterey. Supporting install later with 50% or greater battery life will help ensure even greater coverage of enforcement of software updates. Next, all actions that actually start an install support the use of the bootstrap token from MDM to authorize the installation on Apple Silicon, and one is required for enforcing updates without user interaction that happen automatically. Note, however, that if users act on a notification and begin an update themselves through system preferences, they will be prompted for their password on Apple Silicon. A user does not need to be an administrator to authorize the update. They just need to be a volume owner. macOS Monterey supports installing OS updates when a standard user is logged into the Mac, as well as from the login window when no user is logged in. This helps ensure compatibility with remote or unattended deployments, such as in a computer lab or data center. And in macOS Monterey, there's the ability to use the product version like 12.1 to schedule an update. This reduces the complexity of identifying available software updates, as MDM can now make a single server-side query instead of having to query all of your devices, and compare that query with the software update device ID, which is part of the device information MDM already gets periodically. This makes your update process as simple as selecting a specific version to send to a device. During beta cycles, you can use the same version to install the latest available beta as well. For example, sending 12.1 would install the latest available beta of 12.1, even if your device was already running an earlier beta of 12.1. Now let's go through enforcing updates. As we mentioned earlier, the install force restart action is the ultimate enforcement action and can be used whenever you need to enforce an update right away. But when you know a defined timeline or simply need to ensure compliance with organizational security policies, the new user deferral quota option in macOS Monterey is a great choice. The new user deferral quota option lets you specify a maximum number of times a Mac should prompt a user to install an update before the update is enforced. This uses the install later install action with a new key called max user deferrals. A notification is presented to the user informing them that a required managed update has been requested to install. The title of the notification is Required Managed Update and asks the user when they want to install it. Expanding the notification gives them the option to install the update right away, try to install it that night, or defer it with the Remind Me Tomorrow option. It also includes the number of remaining deferrals for the user, which will decrease by 1 each time they see the notification, approximately once per day. If the user ignores the notification or uses a deferral, no attempt to install the update is made that night. This is an important change we wanted to call out from the behavior described at WWDC. Once the maximum number of deferrals is reached, the notification informs the user that there are no deferrals remaining and the update is scheduled to automatically install that night. macOS will forcefully install the update as if an install force restart install action was used and does require the device to be connected to power or have 50% or more battery life to proceed. If those conditions aren't met, the device will try to force the update again the next night. These improvements to managing software updates using MDM in macOS Monterey will allow you to more easily ensure compliance, manage software compatibility across your fleet, and unify update deployment workflows across both Intel-based Mac computers and Mac computers with Apple Silicon. We encourage you to continue filing feedback on software update management. Be sure to use a managed Apple ID from Apple School Manager or Apple Business Manager to file your feedback through the AppleSeed for IT program. Now let's explore specifics around initial deployment, upgrade, and return to service, starting with initial deployment. For initial deployments of Mac computers in a one-to-one environment, the best experience for both users and IT is to leverage an out-of-box workflow that uses MDM and automated device enrollment as a part of Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager. Automated device enrollment enables device supervision, enables kernel extension management capabilities on Mac computers with Apple Silicon, and can be marked as non-removable, meaning users can't remove the management profile from system preferences or with the Profiles command line tool. Automated device enrollment also allows IT to customize and streamline the setup experience for users by optionally skipping setup screens that would normally be seen during consumer setup of the device. During initial device setup, MDM can hold devices in the Setup Assistant until they're configured with the most critical apps and configurations necessary for first use. As mentioned earlier, we encourage all organizations to use local accounts whenever possible for one-to-one deployments. We'd like to discuss our recommendation for using personal recovery keys or institutional recovery keys, also known as IRKs, with FileVault going forward. On Intel-based Mac computers, an IRK can be used to unlock a FileVault encrypted Mac, disable FileVault using the command line, or more commonly, to recover data using target disk mode. Using an IRK at scale is now considered legacy, and an IRK provides no functional use on Mac computers with Apple Silicon, as Mac sharing mode requires having access to Recovery OS to use. Alternatively, a personal recovery key, or PRK, is unique per encrypted volume, can be escrowed to MDM, and allows for easy key rotation after use. It can be used on a Mac directly to access Recovery OS, or to boot macOS as we showed previously on Apple Silicon. The process for Intel-based Mac computers is similar. A PRK is an extremely robust tool for organizations, and organizations currently using institutional recovery keys should use personal recovery keys instead going forward. For shared environments, we also recommend that you use automated device enrollment for all of the same reasons as one-to-one deployments. Using the Auto Advance feature introduced last year in macOS Big Sur allows for truly zero-touch setup when connected to Ethernet and is super useful for remote or unattended devices. Because multiple users are using the Mac, a directory service or identity provider helper tool often provides access to accounts. In high traffic areas such as a library or a computer lab, consider an account expiration and removal strategy to help clean up local home folders. Whether you script this yourself or use the built-in feature of mobile accounts to automatically expire after a given period of time is up to you. Now let's explore upgrades. When upgrading to macOS Monterey, you can leverage one or more available options, and there are several to enable a lot of flexibility and many different workflows. Ultimately, it will be up to you to decide which option or options work best in your environment. Whether to upgrade in place or erase an upgrade is also up to you. Using MDM to upgrade in place from macOS Big Sur is supported from macOS 11.5 and later, and can be used when a Mac is at the login window. MDM should use the install ASAP install action, and on Apple Silicon, this requires the Bootstrap token. A quick note that no 60-second countdown notification will be shown on Big Sur before the restart happens, but will on macOS Monterey going forward. Next is the command line tool startosinstall, located inside the macOS installer's contents resources folder. This tool allows for workflows using scripting, and it requires having a copy of the macOS installer available to the device, requires elevated privileges to initiate, and you will need to provide volume owner credentials on Apple Silicon. The owner credentials can be from a standard user as long as startosinstall itself is being run with elevated privileges. The erase install flag can handle both upgrading and erasing the Mac at the same time. Note that using erase install on Mac computers with Apple Silicon requires updating the Mac to macOS 11.5 or later before initiating the erase install. Next is an external media installer created with createinstallmedia, also located in the installer's contents resources folder. Reminder that booting to external media is disallowed by default on Mac computers with the Apple T2 security chip, but can be optionally enabled. Using the installer on external media has a minimal network impact during installation, as nearly all of the files necessary for installing macOS are located on the external media itself. If you use the download assets flag when building a bootable macOS installer, Mac computers with the Apple T2 security chip can update the chip's firmware from the external media too. An internet connection is still required, though, to personalize the installation. And lastly, if allowed by your organization, users can also install macOS Monterey on their own using the Install Assistant from the Mac App Store or System Preferences. This is the same experience as consumers and provides users with a graphical walkthrough of the installation steps. It does require administrative privileges to begin the installation, and on Apple Silicon, volume owner credentials are required. Lastly, let's look at return to service, a really important workflow for both education and enterprise. For return to service, the new Erase All Content and Settings feature is the fastest option for Mac computers with the Apple T2 security chip or Apple Silicon. For Mac computers with Apple Silicon, you can use Apple Configurator 2 to restore macOS. Note that using Apple Configurator 2 always installs the latest version of macOS at the time you perform the restore, unless you're restoring from a previously saved IPSW file. The erase install flag on startosinstall can handle both upgrading and erasing the Mac at the same time. Some provisioning tools automatically run startosinstall from the recovery environment for return to service workflows. This is not recommended going forward and is not supported on Mac computers with Apple Silicon. On Intel-based Mac computers, you can use Internet Recovery, and because this is in the context of return to service, you would erase the internal storage first before reinstalling macOS. And on Intel-based Mac computers and those with Apple Silicon, you can use recovery or an external media workflow. Again, in the context of return to service, you would erase the internal storage first using disk utility, or use automation features built into some provisioning tools to do so. Fully erasing a Mac computer with Apple Silicon requires reactivation before macOS can be reinstalled. So that's a summary of deployment workflows. Lastly, to wrap up the presentation, let's turn to available resources. The deployment reference for Mac is a technical document covering topics we discussed today, as well as supporting information about infrastructure and services integration for Mac deployments. The MDM settings guide for IT provides information about available MDM payloads, commands, and queries to help you configure devices in your environment, including information about whether or not payloads can be combined, if they're supported for devices, users, or both, and more. While primarily intended for MDM developers, the MDM developer documentation is an incredibly helpful and thorough resource that's available for you too for helping to understand how MDM works and the options available at the protocol level. The Apple Platform Security documentation provides security information about all software, hardware, and services across the Apple platforms. The AppleCare Professional Support website hosts program information for each of the AppleCare OS support offerings for IT departments and help desks, including AppleCare for Enterprise. We strongly encourage you to test new Apple software in your organization before it's released. The AppleSeed for IT program allows any non-student managed Apple ID from Apple School Manager or Apple Business Manager to participate without needing an invitation. AppleSeed for IT allows you to access and download pre-release Apple software for testing in your environment, includes detailed test plans, and puts your feedback submissions into a dedicated queue for organizations. The release notes are also targeted at organizations, and you can easily reassign feedback to other colleagues to more quickly be able to respond to Apple. Lastly, here's a list of Apple support articles related to topics that we discussed during the presentation. We're super excited about all of the great platform changes, new management features, and deployment workflow improvements in macOS Monterey, and hope you are too. Thanks so much for watching.